Welcome to Block 29 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Rhode Island maple leaf block. For this block, you will need 3 fabrics, a light, a medium, and a dark. From the dark, cut 2 strips that are 1 3/4 by the width of fabric. From these strips, cut 4 rectangles that are 1 3/4 by 3 inches. You also need to cut 24 squares that are 1 3/4 by 1 3/4. I'm cutting on the 5 1/4 inch mark, the 3 1/2 inch mark, and the 1 3/4 inch mark. Cutting backwards like this gives me better accuracy and I don't have to move the fabric as much. From a 2 1/2 inch by width of fabric strip, you also need to cut 1 square that's 2 1/2 inches by 2 1/2 inches. From the medium fabric, cut 1 strip that's 2 1/2 inches by the width of fabric. Cut 4 rectangles 2 1/2 inches by 5 1/2 inches from this strip. From the light, cut 1 strip that's 1 3/4 inches by the width of fabric. From that strip, cut 8 rectangles that are 1 3/4 by 3 inches and 4 squares that are 1 3/4 by 1 3/4. You also need to cut 1 strip that's 2 inches by the width of fabric. From that strip, you need to cut 4 rectangles that are 2 inches by 4 1/4 inches and 4 rectangles that are 2 inches by 5 3/4 inches. Once everything is cut, it's time to head to the sewing machine. Start with 8 light 1 3/4 inch by 3 inch rectangles and 8 1 3/4 inch dark squares. With right sides together, place one of the dark squares on one end of the light rectangle and sew corner to corner. You can draw a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape to help guide you. Once you've sewn them all, cut them apart away from the machine and then trim the seam down to 1/4 inch. Sometimes I will sew another line 1/2 inch away from the first one and cut in between. That way I have spare half square triangle units to use in another project. I have a different plan for these triangles. Press towards the dark fabric. We're going to add 8 more of the 1 3/4 inch dark squares and do the same thing on the opposite end to have flying geese units. Once pressed, these units should measure 1 3/4 inches by 3 inches. If this is the first state block you've seen, check the description below for a link to the playlist of all the other states we've done in this series. To see all the future Celebrating the States blocks, make sure you subscribe. Press towards the dark fabric. Now we can start constructing the 4 corners of the block. Use 1/4 inch seam allowances for the rest of the piecing. With right sides together, piece the 1 3/4 inch light and dark squares to each other. We're going to make 4 of these units. You can press to the dark fabric, or if you prefer, you could press the seam open. Piece the dark 1 3/4 inch by 3 inch rectangles to these units. You can press the seam to the dark fabric, or you can press the seam open if you prefer. We will combine these units with the flying geese units and the 4 dark squares measuring 1 3/4 inches by 1 3/4 inches. When positioning these pieces, make sure the light square is in the center and the flying geese units point to the light square. Sew all of the pieces together and then it'll be time to press towards the squares. As you sew these two units together, double check that both of the flying geese units point to the center square. Press away from the light center square. Piece the light 2" by 4¼ inch rectangles to these units. Make sure that you're sewing the rectangles to one of the sides with the flying geese units. Light fabric should be connected to each other. For accuracy, these light rectangles are just a little larger than they need to be. We will trim later. Press towards the light fabric. Next, we will piece the light 2" by 5¾ inch rectangle to the other side with the flying geese unit. We will press towards the light fabric, and then we need to trim these blocks down to 5½ inches square. First, I square up the corner with the dark fabric, then I flip it around to trim it to 5½ inches by 5½ inches. Now we have all the pieces we need to put the block together. The top row of the block and the bottom row of the block are the same, so those will be two matching units, and then there's the center of the block. Piece the dark 2½ inch square between two medium rectangles that measure 2½ inches by 5½ inches, and then piece the other two medium rectangles between two corner sections. Make two of that unit. Press towards the medium rectangles. Just 2 seams left and block 29 will be finished. Piece the center row between the 2 outer rows. Make sure the dark fabrics point towards the center dark square. Once you're done sewing, press towards that center row and then head to the cutting table to trim your block to 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. I'm making 3 of each block. One is to test the block, and the other 2 are because I'm making one set for each of my 3 children. So I have found these great art bins to put these blocks in, and they hold them perfectly. They're going to keep them nice and safe until I have all of the blocks made for the quilt top. You might be able to find them at your local quilt shop, art supply store, or I will leave a link in the description below if you need it. It's fun to see the blocks starting to pile up. We hope you'll remember to hit the like button, share the video with your quilting friends, leave us a comment, and make sure to subscribe so you will see all the future Celebrating the States videos. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!